Justice runs in the blood. The sun dipped low over the rolling fields of Willow Creek, casting golden streaks across the wheat fields that had been in Margaret Callahan's family for generations. At 93 years old, Margaret still walked her land every morning, her frail but determined frame wrapped in an old shawl. Her farm was her pride, her legacy. But dark times had come to Willow Creek. For months now, a ruthless gang called the Black Vultures had been terrorizing the region. They torched barns, stole livestock, and beat up anyone who stood in their way. Their leader, Jeb "Snake" Rollins, was a cold-blooded outlaw who had already driven several families off their land. Margaret knew her farm was next. The threat arose one evening. As Margaret sat on her porch sipping tea, she heard the sound of motorcycles roaring in the distance. A black pickup truck rumbled down her driveway, dust kicking up behind it. 5 men stepped out. Jeb Rollins, with his scarred face and snake-like grin, swaggered toward her. "Miss Callahan," he drawled. "Hate to do this to a sweet old lady like yourself, but times are changin'. You need to sign over this land and move on. It ain't safe for you no more." Margaret met his gaze, her blue eyes sharp. "I was born on this farm, and I'll die on it before I give it to a bunch of filthy criminals." Jeb's grin faded. He took a step closer, towering over her. "That's real unfortunate. We'll be back in 3 days. You best reconsider." With that, he tipped his hat mockingly and turned away, his men laughing as they climbed back into their vehicles. Margaret sat still, her hands clenched tight. But she had a plan. She shuffled inside, reached for her old rotary phone, and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. The call for help 3,000 miles away, in a Navy base off the coast of California, Lieutenant Ryan Callahan was going through his daily training routine. At 32 years old, he was a decorated Navy SEAL, known for his deadly efficiency and ironclad discipline. When he got his grandmother's call, his blood ran cold. "They're trying to take the farm, Ryan," Margaret said. That was all he needed to hear. "I'm coming, Grandma," he promised. The SEAL returns 2 days later. A black motorcycle roared into Willow Creek. The man riding it was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in dark tactical gear. His steel-gray eyes scanned the land as he parked in front of the farmhouse. Margaret stepped onto the porch, her heart swelling with relief. "You look just like your granddaddy did when he came back from the war," she said, hugging him. Ryan smirked. "Well, let's just say the enemy's about to get a real bad wake-up call." Setting the trap, Ryan spent the next 24 hours fortifying the farm. He set booby traps, rigged the barn with tripwires, and positioned a few surprises around the property. He knew the outlaws would come armed, but they had no idea what kind of warrior they were up against. When the sun dipped below the horizon on the 3rd day, the Black Vultures returned. Jeb Rollins stepped out first, flanked by his men, all armed to the teeth. "Well now," Jeb sneered, "I don't recall inviting no soldier boy to our little party." Ryan stepped forward, his stance unshaken. "You made a mistake coming here, Rollins." Jeb chuckled darkly. "You got guts, SEAL, but you're outnumbered." Ryan smirked. "I like those odds." The battle for the farm. Jeb raised his hand to give the order, but never got the chance. A flashbang detonated near his men, throwing them into chaos. Smoke grenades filled the air, and in the confusion, Ryan struck fast. He took down the first man with a brutal elbow to the throat, disarmed the second with a swift kick, and put the third in a chokehold. Bullets whizzed past him, but Ryan moved like a ghost, using the darkness to his advantage. Jeb, realizing he was losing control, shouted, "Shoot him, damn it." One of his men raised a rifle, but a tripwire snapped beneath his boot, triggering a shotgun shell trap. The blast sent him flying backward. Within minutes, Ryan had neutralized the gang. The remaining men fled into the night, dragging their wounded with them. Jeb, now alone, reached for his gun, but Ryan was faster. He tackled Jeb to the ground, twisting his arm behind his back. "You picked the wrong farm," Ryan growled. Jeb spat blood. "You're gonna regret this." Ryan leaned in close. "Not as much as you." Moments later, sirens wailed in the distance. Margaret had called the sheriff, and soon, the Black Vultures were in handcuffs. A hero's return. As the dust settled, Ryan helped his grandmother onto the porch. "You didn't have to come all this way," she said, squeezing his hand. Ryan smiled. "Of course, I did. Family comes first." Margaret beamed with pride. "Your granddaddy would have been real proud of you." Ryan looked over the land, the field stretching out beneath the moonlight. No outlaw would ever threaten his family's farm again. The black vultures were gone, their leader, Jeb Rollins, hauled off to the county jail. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Tom Walters, tipped his hat to Margaret and Ryan as he loaded the last of the gang into the squad car. "You did a number on M. Callahan," Sheriff Walters said, shaking his head. "Never seen those bastards run scared before." Ryan crossed his arms. "They won't be coming back." The sheriff nodded but sighed. "Maybe not Jeb and his crew, but their kind don't just disappear. Someone else might take their place." Ryan's jaw tightened. He had seen this before. Criminals were like weeds. Cut one down, and another popped up in its place. As the sheriff drove off, Margaret placed a gentle hand on Ryan's arm. "Come inside, dear. You must be starving." Ryan smiled and followed her into the farmhouse, the warmth of home settling into his bones. A deeper threat the next morning, Ryan walked the perimeter of the farm, making sure there was no lingering danger. He inspected the traps he had set, then took a moment to soak in the quiet beauty of Willow Creek. But something felt off. A sense of unease prickled at the back of his neck, the kind of feeling he had learned to trust in the seals. As he approached the old barn, his sharp eyes caught something unusual. Tire tracks. Deep, fresh ones, leading away from the property toward the tree line. He crouched down, running his fingers over the disturbed dirt. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry. But why? His answer came seconds later. A single bullet casing lay nearby, .308 caliber. A sniper's round. Ryan's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a random gang of thugs anymore. Someone had been watching. The bigger fish that night, Ryan sat at the kitchen table with Margaret, sipping coffee as he thought over the discovery. "I don't think it's over, Grandma," he finally said. Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" The black vultures were muscle, dumb and violent, but not the brains of an operation. "That casing outside? It means someone else was watching us." Margaret's face darkened. "I knew Jeb wasn't smart enough to do all this alone." Ryan nodded. "Which means there's a bigger threat out there." As if to confirm his fears, a knock echoed at the front door. Ryan immediately reached for his sidearm, a Glock 19 he had carried since his last deployment. With slow, measured steps, he moved toward the door and peered through the side window. Standing on the porch was a young woman, her clothes dusty and her face streaked with sweat. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder as if she had been followed. Ryan opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you?" "You're Ryan Callahan, right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan didn't answer. The woman took a shaky breath. "My name is Lena Hart. I know who's really behind all this." Ryan and Margaret exchanged glances before stepping aside. "Come in," Margaret said. Lena hesitated, then hurried inside, shutting the door behind her. She sat down at the table, her hands trembling as she reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive. "This has everything," she said. "Bank transfers, documents, orders, proof that the black vultures were just pawns." Ryan inserted the USB into his laptop and scanned the files. His expression darkened as he read through the data. The real mastermind behind the attack on Willow Creek was someone much worse than Jeb Rollins. A name appeared on the screen: Raymond Cutter. Ryan's fists clenched. Cutter was a former arms dealer, a man known for running illegal operations across the country. He had ties to corrupt businessmen, mercenaries, and cartels. If he wanted Margaret's farm, there had to be a bigger reason behind it. Why would a guy like Cutter care about an old farm in the middle of nowhere? Ryan asked. Lena swallowed hard. "Because of what's buried beneath it." Margaret gasped. "What?" Lena nodded. "Decades ago, before this land was a farm, it was used as a supply depot by an old Prohibition-era smuggling ring. They buried something valuable here, something Cutter wants." Ryan's mind raced. "And you know this how?" Lena hesitated before saying, "Because I used to work for him." Ryan's gaze turned sharp. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. "Young lady, you'd better start talking." Lena took a deep breath and said, "He's coming for this place. And he's bringing an army." A war on the horizon. Ryan stood up, his SEAL instincts kicking into high gear. If Cutter was sending men, they wouldn't be like the black vultures. These would be trained killers. "Do you have a place to hide?" Ryan asked Lena. She shook her head. "Nowhere's safe." Ryan's mind was already forming a plan. "Then you stay here. Because if Cutter's coming for this farm." He looked at Margaret and then out the window into the vast fields. "He's walking straight into a war." Margaret, despite her age, gave a wicked little smirk. You got that Callahan fight in you, don't you? Ryan smirked back. Damn right I do. He grabbed his phone and made a call. Hey, boys. I need backup. Within hours, Ryan's old Navy SEAL team would be en route. If Cutter wanted war, he was about to get one. The night was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that only meant one thing: a storm was coming. Ryan Callahan stood on the porch of his grandmother's farmhouse, his sharp eyes scanning the distant tree line. He knew they were out there, Raymond Cutter's men, watching, waiting. Unlike the Black Vultures, these weren't mere thugs. These were trained mercenaries, ex-military, killers who had fought in wars across the world. But Ryan wasn't alone. Inside the farmhouse, 3 of his former Navy SEAL teammates, Hawk, Deacon, and Cruz, were gearing up, checking weapons and securing defensive positions. These were men Ryan had fought beside in some of the most dangerous missions overseas, and when he called, they didn't hesitate. This feels like old times, Hawk muttered, loading a fresh magazine into his M4 rifle. Yeah, Deacon smirked. Except this time, the mission is to protect a 93-year-old woman. Margaret Callahan, sitting at the kitchen table, stirred her tea and looked up. I may be old, but I can still handle a shotgun, boys. Ryan chuckled, but his face quickly turned serious. He turned to Lena, the woman who had brought the truth about Cutter's plans to light. How many men do you think he's bringing? Lena swallowed. At least 20, maybe more. Cutter doesn't take chances. If he's coming hard. Ryan nodded. Then we'll hit him harder. The attack begins at midnight. The first sign of trouble came. The roar of engines echoed across the farm as black SUVs and motorcycles surged down the dirt road. Their headlights cut through the darkness like piercing eyes. Ryan stood on the roof of the barn, sniper rifle in hand, scanning the approaching vehicles through his scope. Here they come, he muttered into his earpiece. Down below, Deacon, Cruz, and Hawk crouched behind cover, rifles at the ready. Let's give him a warm welcome, Cruz said with a grin. As Cutter's men moved closer, Ryan pulled the trigger. Bang! The first sniper shot took out the driver of the lead SUV, causing the vehicle to swerve violently and crash into a fence. Chaos erupted as the mercenaries jumped out, guns blazing. That was their mistake. Boom. A tripwire explosion detonated near the barn, sending 3 men flying. The air filled with the sounds of gunfire, shouts, and the crack of rifle rounds as the SEALs engaged their enemy. Hawk and Deacon opened fire, picking off mercenaries one by one, their shots precise and deadly. Ryan shifted positions, moving swiftly across the rooftop, eliminating targets with lethal efficiency. Cutter's men returned fire, but they were outmatched. Face to face with the devil in the midst of the chaos, a black armored vehicle rolled onto the property. The back doors burst open, and a tall, menacing figure stepped out. Raymond Cutter. Dressed in a tactical vest, Cutter was a beast of a man, his face hardened by years of violence. He carried an FN SCAR rifle, and his cold eyes locked onto Ryan. I knew you'd be trouble, Callahan, Cutter called out over the gunfire. Ryan smirked. You should have stayed in the shadows, Cutter. Cutter lifted his rifle. Let's end this. The 2 warriors charged at each other. Cutter fired first, but Ryan rolled into cover, avoiding the bullets. He popped up, returning fire, forcing Cutter to retreat behind an overturned tractor. Then, hand-to-hand combat. Cutter lunged, swinging a brutal punch. Ryan dodged, countering with a powerful knee to the ribs. Cutter grunted but grabbed Ryan and slammed him against the barn wall. The 2 men grappled, exchanging heavy blows, fist cracking against bone. Cutter swung a knife, aiming for Ryan's throat. Ryan caught his wrist and, with a lightning-fast move, disarmed him and drove the knife into Cutter's thigh. Cutter roared in pain but wasn't done yet. He grabbed Ryan by the collar, lifting him off his feet. But before he could do more, bang! A shotgun blast rang out. Cutter staggered back, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped through his vest. Standing on the porch, shotgun in hand, was Margaret Callahan. Didn't your mother ever teach you not to mess with a Callahan? She said, cocking the gun. Cutter fell to his knees, his strength fading. Ryan walked over, looking down at the defeated man. Game over. Moments later, the sheriff's sirens blared in the distance. A new dawn by morning, Cutter and his surviving men were in custody. The threat to Willow Creek was finally over. Ryan stood by the fence, watching the sunrise. Hawk, Deacon, and Cruz leaned beside him, exhausted but victorious. Margaret stepped out onto the porch, looking at the land she had fought so hard to protect. Well, that was one hell of a night, she said. Ryan turned to her and smiled. Yeah, but the farm is safe now. Margaret nodded. Because of you. Ryan looked around at his brothers in arms, at Lena, who had found redemption in helping them, and at his grandmother, the strongest woman he knew. Maybe it was time for him to come home for good. Margaret must have sensed his thoughts because she patted his hand. The farm could use a strong young man to take care of it, you know. Ryan chuckled. I'll think about it. For the first time in a long time, peace had returned to Willow Creek. And Ryan Callahan knew that as long as he was alive, no one would ever take that away.